Hello and welcome to our final lesson in this introductory module on the key concepts you need to know in this course and also how to get the most out of this course and use it effectively and efficiently. This lesson is really all about that last point, how to use the course effectively and efficiently. And specifically, what I want to address is the fact that there is a ton of content here. As I say in this written PDF document that you can download right below the video, there are a lot of lessons, over 200 lessons and over 80 hours of video as I'm recording this. By the time you see this, there may actually be more because we do add to the course and refine it over time. So that obviously represents quite a big time commitment. If you think about the math, if you spend, say, 2 or 3 hours per day going through this, at the bare minimum, on the surface, it would seem that you would need at least a few months to get through all the material here. Now, obviously, we're all busy, and realistically, you may not have enough time to actually do that. So I want to cover here a few different ways that you can use the course more efficiently and how you can get a lot out of it, even if you only have, say, 8 hours to prepare for interviews, or if you only have 1 week to prepare, or maybe if you only have 2 or 3 weeks to prepare for interviews. Now, obviously, the ideal case is that you do have, say, 3 months or 6 months or something in that range, and that as a result, you can actually go through all the material here sequentially. So you can go through Module 1 up through Module 12, Module 13, and beyond, and complete everything here sequentially. And if you do have the time, if you're in school right now or you're working and you have a certain amount of free time after work each day, then yes, that is the best way to get the full picture here of everything and to really master the concepts. But if you have much more limited time or you're aiming for certain roles, so for example, you know that you're going in for private equity interviews, then you don't necessarily want to go through everything here sequentially. You can and should skip around and focus on certain material and certain lessons and skip everything that is not relevant. The way this course was designed, we really wanted to cater to all roles. So, for example, if you're in investment banking or you're interviewing at an investment bank, then yes, a lot of this is going to be relevant. But for example, if you're going in to interview at a hedge fund, then the material on merger models and LBO models is just not going to be as relevant because in most of those types of roles, you don't need to know as much about acquiring entire companies and then potentially selling entire companies in the future. So in that case, the material up above on the 3 financial statements, accounting, projecting the financial statements, and then valuation, valuing companies and making investment recommendations, this becomes a lot more relevant and a lot better for you to focus on. One thing I'll say before we get started is that if you really only have 2 hours before your interview or some other extreme time constraint like that, forget it. This is not going to be the course for you. Sometimes we get people who sign up in a panic and say, oh, I have a case study due in an hour and I need to figure out what to do. You're not going to be able to get enough out of this course if you only have a few hours before your interviews or your case study is due. You really need to take some amount of time to be able to go through the Excel files, the written documents, the PDFs, the videos, the transcripts. If you only have 1 or 2 days, yes, potentially you could still get a good last minute boost. But as I say here, ideally you will need at least a week. And we think realistically to really benefit, you probably need more like 2 to 3 weeks. And to get the most possible out of it, we would say probably more like 2 to 3 months. And to master all the nuances, including more of the material that applies to the job itself, we would probably say more like 6 months. But nevertheless, we are going to try to pare down what is in the course and give you a more concise study plan. So I'm going to start with the 8-hour plan, then go to the 1-week plan, and then look at what you might do for investment banking interviews, and then private equity interviews, and then equity research, asset management, and hedge fund interviews, and then corporate development and corporate finance interviews. And if you're interviewing for a role outside of these, you have to figure out what it's closest to out of these 4 possibilities. If you can't do that, then leave a question or comment or email us directly and we can let you know what might be relevant or which of these study plans is closest to what you're looking for. Let's go to the 8-hour plan first. At this level, you really do not have time to complete the Excel files or the practice exercises. So we recommend only looking at the videos and only looking at the written transcripts. If, for example, you are literally on your way to the interview and you want to look at something on your phone or tablet to review in the meantime. So with this study plan, within the module on the 3 financial statements, the ones on the income statement, balance sheet, and cash flow statement, the rules and the summary for those are incredibly important, and you need to know those at the bare minimum for any type of finance interview. If you don't know those, forget it. You're not even going to progress further in the interview process, because those are the fundamentals you need to know for any role. Now in the next module, which is more focused on interview questions, here there are around 35 lessons, but if you just look at 3 or 4 of the key ones that put together a lot of the concepts, you can actually save time, because you don't need to know the details of every last single line item here. If you look at the one on depreciation and amortization, which is the classic interview question, by the way, and then you get the model from that, you look at some of the Excel files from the rest, you can have a pretty good sense of what to expect for these types of questions. Beyond that, we actually recommend skipping the next 2 modules on Atlassian and EasyJet, which are both based on 3 statement projection models, mostly because these are not likely to come up in interviews. These are very likely to be presented as case study questions, but in a pure interview, they're not going to ask you questions about this, because these are more mechanical and execution related as opposed to conceptual. So the more conceptual modules after this will be the ones on equity value, enterprise value, and multiples, the ones on valuation, and then the more basic merger model and the more basic LBO model. Within those, for the one on equity value, enterprise value, and multiples, the first few lessons here are very helpful because they lay out exactly what these concepts mean and how you calculate them and why they're important. The one on enterprise value and why you add and subtract certain items is also very helpful, because it lays out this concept in a more concise way and makes it easier to think about than what you might have read or seen in other sources. Beyond that, in the valuation modules, there's a lot of material on public comps and precedent transactions, but the truth is that if you understand how to interpret them and what they mean, those are the most likely interview questions. So we recommend actually just looking at those 2 lessons. Then the one on the discounted cash flow analysis, this is another classic interview question, so you need to know a good amount of material here. We have some of the overview lessons on how to calculate unlevered free cash flow, also how to calculate the terminal value, weighted average cost of capital, and how different factors impact the DCF, another classic type of interview question. We actually recommend skipping module number 9 because you're not going to get questions on this, and if you have very limited time, you don't even have time to go through all the documents here. Module 10 and module 12. So these are both introductory modules to the merger model and LBO model. We have some of the introductory lessons on these topics here in the merger model, and then a few lessons later on. And then in the LBO model, we really just have the first 2 lessons in the course, because at this level, you don't have time to go through it in detail, but you do need to know about the concept and the how and why it works, and some of the rules of thumb that you can use to calculate returns and decide what makes for a good buyout candidate. Now let's move to case number 2, if you have a week of time. A lot of this is very similar, except now we are aiming for 20 hours of preparation time, which comes out to around 3 hours per day, which we think is probably reasonable if you have an interview coming up and it's an important interview that you have to take seriously. Within Module 2, again, you need to know the 3 financial statements. However, we would also add the lessons on working capital and the ones on free cash flow and what to do with it, because those are both important concepts that you should really understand earlier on as opposed to later. But for the most part, it's still fairly similar. In Module 3, again, mostly the same idea here. Take a look at the key lessons. You can get a lot of the benefit from reviewing those 3 or 4 key lessons as opposed to going through all 35. Then Module 4, if you have a week of time, we do recommend going through this, because even though it's more case study related, you could still get questions on items such as how you project capital expenditures or how you link the financial statements, a very likely topic to come up, and also just how you think about revenue and expenses for a company. And then there's the fact that, yes, it is more case study related, but you never know. In an interview, they could give you a case study on this topic. So we do recommend going through selected lessons there in this study plan. Now, Module 6 on equity value, enterprise value, and multiples. Again, those first few lessons on the basic concepts are still important. We also recommend a few lessons on how to actually calculate equity value. The treasury stock method in particular is a very common interview question, so we recommend going through that. And then the last one on what goes into enterprise value. Moving on, Module 7, we've just added some lessons on how to select public comps and precedent transactions, but the idea there is still the same. Module 8, we've added some lessons because the DCF just comes up so frequently in interviews. This is probably the single most important topic for any type of generic finance interview. So we have some lessons on the step-by-step process, on how to calculate a company's implied value, and more detail on weighted average cost of capital and cost of equity. So there are some differences there. And then in Module 9, we recommend actually going through it this time around because there are some points that could come up. For example, they could ask you in an interview, how do you actually use valuation in real life? And if you complete some of these lessons, the ones we recommend, you'll have a really good sense of how to do that. Now, Module 10, the merger model, this one, there is a ton of material, but a lot of it, especially toward the end, is more optional because we just go into details of how the acquisition of a private company might be different, or we go through some case study exercises. Those can be helpful, but in general, understanding the concepts, why you would buy a company, how it works, how the math works, those are always going to be important, so we put those first. And then a few of the key lessons in the mechanics could come up, and it's good to know about topics like purchase price allocation. And then the additional practice exercises at the end, you could potentially skip these, but in our opinion, it's better to focus your time on these types of practice exercises as opposed to going into a lot more advanced material because these are taken directly from interviews. So readers and students of our courses over the years have sent us these types of exercises, and we based all these on real exercises given at banks. Again, we would say skip Module 11 because it's just not going to come up in interviews. It's way too advanced. And then Module 12, the basic LBO model here. These 7 key lessons are the most important. The conceptual ones, how to set up the model and make your assumptions and how the debt schedules work, and then how to calculate the returns at the end and how to simplify your model even further. So that's what we recommend if you have a week of time. Fairly similar to what to do if you only have 8 hours, but of course, if you do have more time, you can go into some of these other topics that you had to skip over under the more time-constrained scenario. Now let's go to investment banking interview prep. I don't really have too much to say here because it's really all contained within the writing and this written Word document. But this time around, we're changing our approach a little bit, and we're not really listing specific lessons or links to specific lessons. Instead, we're just going module by module and saying what to skip and what to cover. So in the first one on the 3 financial statements, the ones that you should complete are the same as the ones that we went through before, the 3 financial statements and then working capital and free cash flow, and skip everything else unless you need to learn or review accounting in the first place. The one on accounting interview questions, these could actually all come up in interviews, and it may be somewhat intimidating because there are 30 or 35 lessons here, but these are all very short. A lot of these are 4 minutes, 5 minutes, so you can actually get through these fairly quickly if you are inclined to do that. The one on Atlassian and the 3 financial statements there, we do recommend completing the same lessons as in the 20-hour study plan. Skip the one on EasyJet because this is way beyond what you need for entry-level banking interviews. The module on equity value, enterprise value, and multiples, again, you really need to know these concepts, and if you have more like 2 or 3 weeks of time, you have the luxury of being able to spend some more time on some of the more nuanced concepts here. So just follow what we've recommended. In particular, with the one on equity value enterprise value, and valuation multiples. These lessons on how to calculate the actual multiples and the differences between different types of free cash flow are a lot more important. And again, these are common interview questions, so that's why I've listed them here. With the valuation, you just have more time. So for example, in this set of lessons, you can go through more of the detail behind how we come up with revenue and expenses for the company covered there, Jazz Pharmaceuticals. And then the DCF lessons, you can go through most of it and really just skip the lessons that are more optional related to, for example, how the Gordon growth formula works and the proof for that. No one's going to ask you that in an interview, so we recommend skipping it. The lesson on calendarization in the valuation module, it's good to know for on the job and on the job prep, but in interviews, no one's really going to ask you that type of question, so that's why we recommend skipping it. And then the last one, just complete the ones on the football field chart and how to create that, and then also the investment banking pitch book. Now the merger model, this is fairly important for investment banking roles, and it's a common source of questions. However, there are some lessons here that you can skip. In general, the entire module is pretty important, but if you had to pick a few to skip over, we would say that the financial projections for the buyer and seller are less important here because they're not going to ask these types of questions in the context of a merger model. They're going to ask them more for standalone companies, or it's not going to be part of the types of questions they ask on this topic. And then some questions or some lessons at the end on private companies and how acquisitions of private companies differ. Again, those are good to know, and it's good to know for on the job, but they're not likely to ask about this type of thing. And to be honest, these lessons are not that much different from the ones for acquisitions of public companies, so that's why we recommend skipping over those. Then for the leverage buyout model, again, these are all pretty important because you could easily get questions on this even in entry-level interviews. But there are some lessons that are more about how to project revenue and expenses for a hotel company. They're not generally going to ask you that because it's too specific to the industry, so we recommend skipping over those. And then there are some others. Toward the end, for example, there are some lessons on how to present your case study findings. Again, they're not going to ask you to do that in an investment banking interview, so you can just skip over it. And then the more advanced LBO model, I would just skip this for now. This is much more relevant for private equity interviews. It's overkill for banking interviews, so we recommend skipping it. That's the study plan for investment banking. Now let's move to the private equity study plan. The biggest point I will raise here is that a lot of people mistakenly assume that since private equity firms buy companies and sell them in leverage buyouts, that's all you need to know about. So they mistakenly think, okay, well, I'm just going to study the material on leverage buyouts. There are two problems with that. The first problem is that you will get questions on other technical topics, on accounting, on valuation, potentially even on M&A deals and merger models. It doesn't matter if you're a career changer. It doesn't matter if you haven't done investment banking before. They will still ask about these topics. I remember one private equity interview I went into a long time ago when I was working in the industry. They started out by asking me a bunch of accounting questions about cost of goods sold and inventory, even though it was a private equity interview. So don't underestimate the chances of getting questions on other topics. It's a really big misconception that you're only going to get questions on LBOs. It's not true at all. The other issue with just going straight to the LBO related lessons is that if you don't understand some of these other concepts, such as equity value and enterprise value, understanding something like the returns analysis in an LBO is going to be very, very difficult. So you have to have some type of grounding in the other topics first before you get into this. It's no coincidence that the LBO modeling modules and lessons are toward the end of this course, because you really need to understand a lot of the other concepts first before you get into this. Here's what we recommend. If you don't know accounting, you need to know the 3 financial statements and some of these details. Otherwise, it's going to be pretty much impossible to understand leverage buyout models. And we recommend getting additional practice with the Atlassian case study as well. And of course, you need to know equity value, enterprise value, and multiples, as I just said. Once you have these basic topics under your grasp and understand them fairly well, then we recommend going into the LBO modeling case studies and the lessons there. We recommend completing both the basic model and the more advanced one. If you really don't have time, yes, you can skip the more advanced one, but we do recommend completing both of them, especially if you have these upcoming private equity interviews and you have some experience with modeling before. Now, beyond that, the other topics admittedly are a bit less important, so that's why we've put them after everything up here. Valuation could easily still come up, and so it is good to understand this, even though it probably shouldn't be your top priority. And the DCF analysis, how to use valuation, those are also still important for private equity interviews. The difference is that, again, they're not going to focus on these quite as much as, say, an investment banking interviewer would. So that's why we put them lower on the list. Now, merger models, and then these accounting interview questions about how items like depreciation changing impact the statements. These tend to be a little bit less important, but you could still get questions on them in interviews, so that's why we've positioned them here in the list. With merger models, if you're really time constrained, just learn the basics in lessons 1 through 3 and leave it at that. With the accounting interview questions, again, just take a look at the lessons on depreciation and the multi-step scenarios at the end, and you'll understand this pretty well. The two modules we recommend skipping, the more advanced 3-statement projections and the more advanced merger model, we recommend this because these are just not relevant for private equity interviews. They're not going to ask you detailed nuances of merger models because you don't really do that in private equity. You're acquiring other companies, yes, but you're not combining them with existing companies as much. And then the one on more advanced 3-statement projections, this is really more relevant for hedge funds and asset management and equity research and anyone else that has to deal with 3-statement projections and evaluating how a company is using its capital. But generally speaking, you're not quite as focused on this in private equity. And also, this is very industry specific. It's very specific to airlines, so not quite as useful for more generalist private equity interviews. That's our study plan there. Now let's move into equity research, asset management, and hedge funds. The key difference with these roles is that you don't need to know that much about M&A deals, merger models, leverage buyouts, or LBO models. So if you go back to the course on the site, the last segment of modules here, all these, and then the more advanced LBO model below this one, these just become a lot less relevant for these types of roles. And so the ones up at the top are probably the ones you want to focus on. And more specifically, the ones on 3-statement projections are going to be very, very important here, as will the ones on valuation, and especially in Module 9, where we go through and actually create an equity research report and a stock pitch for the company that we analyze there. So here's what we recommend. Again, you need to know accounting before you do any of this. So if you don't know the 3 financial statements, you really have to start there. There is one subtle difference here, which is that the last lesson in this module, which covers key metrics and ratios, it's very important for these types of roles. It's less important for investment banking and private equity roles. So that's why I've included it in this list, but I didn't include it in the other ones before this. With the accounting interview question module, again, it's really up to you. If you don't know these concepts, yes, I would actually recommend completing all these lessons. If you do already know them, then you can skip over this because you're not going to learn anything new there. Modules 4 and 5, as I just mentioned, complete all of them. These are both highly relevant for these roles. Yes, Atlassian is a private company, so it's not the type of company you would invest in at a hedge fund, but the principles you still need to know because you then apply them to this more advanced model for a public company, EasyJet. Of course, you still need to know equity value, enterprise value, and valuation multiples because it's going to come up all the time in these types of interviews, and also with what you do in case studies for them. And then the ones on valuation and the DCF analysis, these are largely the same as what we had above, and I strongly recommend going through these because these are by far the most important lessons if you're going to work at one of these places, because you're going to be spending most of your time deciding whether companies are overvalued, undervalued, or valued appropriately. So the valuation related lessons are incredibly important here. Now, the last segment of lessons here on merger models and LBO models, skip the more advanced ones. These are just not relevant unless you're working at a fund or you're interviewing at a fund that does something like merger arbitrage. These are just not that relevant. However, the more basic material, you should actually be familiar with this. This is a little bit counterintuitive, and a lot of people mistakenly assume that you don't need to know anything about these models at a hedge fund, for example, but you still need to know the basics because companies that you're following could get acquired or could be bought out by a private equity firm. Those types of scenarios happen, and so we do recommend going through at least the introductory lessons in these two modules. So don't just assume that you should skip these entirely. You should at least look at the first few lessons in both of these so you have a sense of what a leveraged buyout model is and what a merger or acquisition actually is. That's our study plan for these public markets roles, equity research, asset management, and hedge funds. Let's move to our last case now, corporate development and corporate finance interview prep. The first thing I'll mention here is that this course wasn't really designed for this exactly. Now, a lot of the material does still apply. For example, the lessons on accounting and projecting a company's financial statements, those still apply because if you're in these roles, you will be spending a lot of time doing that. It's just that you're doing it for your own company or maybe a company that you're considering acquiring. You're not just looking at companies that you have no association or affiliation with. So a lot of the material applies, but in these types of interviews, especially corporate finance, they will ask you questions on journal entries for accounting, compliance, tax issues, a lot of accounting questions that go beyond the scope of what we cover in the course, because from our perspective, these are just not that useful if you're advising a company on a deal or you're thinking about investing in a company. But if you're working internally at a company, these become more important. And same with FP&A, financial planning and analysis roles. There's just material here that we don't cover because it goes beyond the scope of this course. So do be aware that with all that said, if you are preparing for one of these roles or preparing for interviews, then we do have some recommendations down here. Once again, accounting is very important. So if you don't know this, yes, you absolutely need to know this. And I would say here as well that if you don't know anything about accounting right now, lessons 1 through 17 in the module on the 3 financial statements are especially important because you really need to know what those line items mean if you're working at a normal company and you're actually dealing with the budgeting process or recording journal entries associated with those types of items. Similarly, the modules on projecting the 3 financial statements are also important, and we recommend completing them because you'll be doing a lot of this type of work on the job. You may not get questions this advanced in interviews, but it's still good to know. Now, technically, in the next section, for corporate finance roles, you're not going to get questions on valuation in interviews in most cases, but we still recommend completing these because if you really want to understand what's going on in other departments or what's going on with an acquisition, for example, you need to know something about valuation. So these concepts, equity value, enterprise value, multiples, public comps, precedent transactions, the discounted cash flow analysis, we still view these as important, even if you won't necessarily get questions on them in interviews. And then the last few modules here, the merger model, if you're just in a corporate finance role, you can really skip this. It's not that important. Obviously, though, if you're in a corporate development role, then it's much more important because you're actually acquiring other companies. So you need to know something about it. And the more advanced merger model, if you're in a role where you're going to do a lot of cross-border deals or acquisitions, this now becomes more important. We recommended skipping over it in some of the previous outlines and study plans, but here it is still worth going through. So we do recommend that in this case. And then the ones on leverage buyout models, skip the more advanced one, but the basic one, it is still good to be acquainted with the basics. So we recommend lessons 1 and 2, and then number 12. Lesson number 12 here is just about how to calculate the returns at the end, and lessons 1 and 2 are about the LBO modeling concept. So that's our recommendation for this particular case. A few other points I'll make before closing out this lesson. We strongly recommend completing the quiz questions. So for example, if you go to view in HD or you just go to view larger video, if you open it in this view and then you start playing the video, you will get in-video quiz questions throughout, and we strongly recommend completing those. I'll just show you an example right now. You can see that if you progress past a certain point, you get this option to take quiz now, and then you can answer this question, and then you can get immediate feedback on your result. This is a very concise way to review the material as you're going through the lesson, so we strongly recommend completing these. There are also before and after Excel files in each lesson. If you have the time to do so, yes, complete them. If you only have a day or a week, no, skip over it. But if you have a few weeks up to a few months, then yes, these are definitely worthwhile, especially for the lessons where you don't know the material quite as well. And then same applies to the Word documents and the presentations. Everything in this course is framed as a case study. And so if you just read our solutions, you're not going to get that much out of it. If you have the time to go in and answer all the questions on your own, you should definitely do that. They don't have to be long answers, they don't have to be very detailed, but at least come up with some type of short answer to all the questions so you can test your knowledge at the end. That's about it for the walkthrough of this document. I'm not going to summarize everything because we went through a lot and it is all in written form here anyway. But what I will say is that the main point of this lesson is that even if you only have 8 hours to prepare, you can still get something out of the course. Even if you only have 1 week to prepare, you can still get something out of it. Ideally, you'll have at least more like 2 to 3 weeks. And even more ideally, you'll have more like 2 to 3 months. But if you don't have that amount of time, we wanted to present these study plans so that you can still get something out of it. And then maybe later on, when you do have more time, you can come back and complete additional lessons or more of the optional material later on. That's it for this lesson. Coming up next, we're going to be delving into the second module on the 3 financial statements, one of the most important concepts in accounting and finance, and something that we're going to spend quite a bit of time covering in this course.